Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. Edward here, your quiet companion for another evening of reason and reflection. Tell me, is there paper near you tonight? A notebook, perhaps, or a letter set aside for later. There is something in the mere presence of the written page that sharpens the mind wonderfully. Watson understood this. He trusted the page to hold what memory might soften, or sentiment might alter. Do subscribe, so these evenings of careful thought are never missed. Now, settle in. For as Holmes observed, what appears most blank is often most full of meaning. You'll find Watson's Margins on Spotify. The link is just below, in the description. Chapter 1, The Fog upon Baker Street. It is a singular fact, which I have remarked upon more than once, in the course of my long association with Mr. Sherlock Holmes, that the character of London's weather seems often to conspire with the nature of the business which finds its way to our rooms in Baker Street. I do not advance this observation as anything more than the fancy of a man grown accustomed to coincidence fast. Yet I confess that when I look back upon the affair which I have set myself to record here, I find it impossible to separate the events of that November evening from the dense, sulphurous fog which had settled over the city since earliest morning, pressing itself against the window panes of our sitting room, like some inquisitive and unwholesome presence. I had returned that afternoon from a consultation in Paddington, my coat damp and my boots soiled with the peculiar grey clay which the London pavements produce in wet weather, to find Holmes precisely as I had left him 4 hours before. He lay extended upon the sofa in his mouse-coloured dressing-gown, cold pipe balanced upon the arm of the cushion beside him, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, and his grey eyes fixed upon the ceiling with that expression of concentrated vacancy which I had long since learned to distinguish from simple idleness. Before him, spread across the ottoman in studied disorder, lay 3 morning newspapers, monograph, upon the properties of certain reactive inks which he had himself composed the previous spring, and a shallow glass dish in which some brownish residue had dried to a crust. "You have had a disagreeable afternoon," said he, without turning his head. "The fog alone would have made it disagreeable," I replied, hanging my coat and settling into my armchair beside the fire. The patient in question was a thoroughly trying woman who refused to accept the diagnosis I had arrived at. After 20 minutes of careful examination, "Is there any tea?" Mrs. Hudson brought some at 4:30. "It will be stone cold." He unfolded himself from the sofa and crossed to the window, peering down at Baker Street below with the dissatisfied air of a man who finds the external world failing to provide sufficient stimulus. "The lamplighter has passed twice," he said. "He is uncertain of his own route in this murk. Carriage which has been standing opposite for the last 10 minutes belongs to a professional man of the law. The horse is hired, not owned. Driver does not know the address he is bound for. You deduce all that from a window in this fog? The driver has consulted a paper 3 times in as many minutes, and has twice leaned down to address a passer-by. He is lost, Watson, or his instructions are inadequate. As for the legal profession, you will observe. No, the fog has thickened. You would not observe anything useful at this distance. I shall simply tell you the dispatch case briefly visible when the carriage door opened bore the stamp of the Clerkenwell Magistrates' Court. And now, if I am not mistaken, we are about to receive a visitor." He turned from the window with the brightened expressions I had not seen upon his features for a fortnight. The months preceding this particular evening had been lean ones, for the kind of intellectual sustenance Holmes required. 2 cases of a purely mechanical nature. A brief consultation with the Metropolitan Police. Upon a question of handwriting, and an afternoon's chemical analysis conducted for the benefit of a city banker. These had occupied his energies without engaging his imagination, and the effects upon his temperament had been, I must acknowledge, somewhat trying for those about him. There came presently the sound of footsteps upon the stair, measured and deliberate, with that slight hesitation at the landing which speaks of a man unaccustomed to the ascent, accompanied by a second pair of lighter steps which I attributed to Mrs. Hudson. "The knock at our door was firm," said Holmes, turning to his chair and drawing his dressing gown about him with a composure which might, to a stranger, appeared studied indifference, but which I recognised as the particular attention of a man who has already begun to observe. Our landlady admitted 2 gentlemen. The first was a man of perhaps 60 years, spare and upright in his bearing, the complexion of one who has spent a lifetime in stuffy professional rooms, rather than open air, pair of keen grey eyes behind gold-framed spectacles, which surveyed our sitting-room with the rapid, methodical appraisal of one accustomed to assessing evidence. His coat was of excellent quality, but somewhat worn at the left cuff, the cuff of the writing hand, and his boots, though freshly polished, bore traces of the distinctive whitish clay of Bloomsbury upon their sides. He carried a leather dispatch case of official character, and he held it with the care of a man transporting something whose loss would cause him grave inconvenience. The second gentleman was younger by perhaps 15 years, of medium height and pleasant, open countenance, light brown hair parted with precision, and the slightly over-attentive expression of a man determined to create a favourable impression. He was neatly, even fastidiously dressed. His cravat was arranged with a care which spoke of vanity or habit, and his hands, I noticed, were remarkably clean for a man who had arrived through such an evening. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" said the elder man. "I am Septimus Vale, solicitor, attached to the magistrate's court at Clerkenwell. This is Mr. Adrian Mowbray, chief clerk of the same court. I trust you will forgive this unannounced intrusion upon your evening, but I have been advised by several persons whose judgment I respect that the nature of our difficulty renders ordinary channels of inquiry entirely inadequate." "Pray sit down, Mr. Vale," said Holmes, indicating the chairs which I had drawn forward. "You and Dr. Watson, I perceive, have not previously met, though you have heard of him. You may speak as freely before him as before me. Your difficulty involves official records which have been tampered with. The matter has already attracted unwelcome attention from persons whose embarrassment you are at present endeavouring to prevent." Vale paused in the act of seating himself and looked sharply at Holmes across the lamplight. "You have been informed of the matter?" "I have been informed of nothing. Your dispatch case, your professional address, your evident anxiety. Despite an outward attempt at composure, the particular manner in which Mr. Mowbray here has twice glanced at said case since entering the room. These are sufficient to suggest the broad outline. Now, if you will be good enough to tell me the particulars, we may perhaps make some progress." Vale set the dispatch case upon his knees, opened it with deliberate care, withdrew from its interior a volume bound in the dark green cloth characteristic of official court publications. It was a summons book of the type used to record legal notices issued by the magistrates. thick and serviceable object, perhaps 12 inches in length. He placed it upon the table before Holmes. "Every page," said Vale quietly, "is blank." Holmes took up the volume and turned it in his hands with the thoughtful deliberation of a bibliophile handling a rare edition. He opened it at the centre, then at the beginning, then at some point toward the latter quarter. He held a page at an angle to the lamp. He raised it briefly to his face. Then he set it down and looked at Vale. "This book," said he, "contained records of court summonses issued over a period of some weeks, I take it. Over a period of 6 weeks, beginning the 14th of September and concluding the 23rd of October of this year. During that period, 43 summonses were issued and recorded in this book in the ordinary course of business. Every one of those records has vanished. The pages appear, as you observe, perfectly clean. Yet not, I think, uniformly clean." Holmes had already returned to the volume. "You have a sharp eye, Mr. Vale. The pages are indeed not uniformly clean. Here, in the earlier sections, there is a faint warmth to the paper, residual quality to the grain, which is absent in certain later pages. But I shall examine this more carefully presently. Tell me the consequences of this disappearance." Vale removed his spectacles, polished them with a precise, habitual motion, and replaced them. "Several debtors and witnesses have claimed before the court that they never received summonses to appear. Others insist that they answered notices, for which there now exists no official record. The administration of the court is thrown into confusion. Post. If it is concluded that records have been deliberately falsified or destroyed, the implications for the court's integrity and for the reputations of those who administered the records during that period will be very grave indeed." "And yet," said Holmes, turning his gaze with a quality of mild but undeniable attention toward the younger man, "Mr. Mowbray here, as chief clerk, bears the most immediate professional responsibility for the integrity of those records, appears, if I may venture the observation, remarkably composed for a man in so difficult a position." Mowbray smiled pleasantly. "I am composed, Mr. Holmes, because I have nothing to conceal, and because I believe the matter capable of rational explanation. I was as astonished as anyone by the discovery, and I am very eager indeed to see it resolved." Holmes looked at him for a moment with the expression I knew well, the expression of a man filing a fact whose significance he has not yet determined. Then he rose from his chair and moved to the window. Outside, the fog had thickened still further. The street lamps of Baker Street were reduced to pale, smudged circles of amber light, and the sound of the city was muffled to a remote, indistinct murmur, as though London itself were holding its breath. "Very well, Mr. Vale," said Holmes, without turning from the glass. "Hint to this matter. You will leave the summons book with me, and you will be good enough to arrange that I may visit the records office at the Clerkenwell Court tomorrow. Full access and without advance notice to the staff. That can be arranged. One further question, for the moment. Among the 43 missing records, were the cases to which they related distributed across the ordinary range of court business? Was there any pattern to their subject matter?" Vale and Mowbray exchanged a glance of the kind which I have learned to read as significant. The glance of two men who have already discussed a point and reached, between them, a tacit agreement about how much to reveal. "That," said Vale, after a brief pause, "is a question which I confess I had not previously considered." "Then I commend it to your consideration before tomorrow," said Holmes pleasantly. "Good evening, gentlemen. Watson, the tobacco is in the Persian slipper, if you would care to join me in a pipe." I believe we shall have an interesting few days before us." After our visitors had descended and the street door had closed behind them, I took up the summons book myself and turned its blank pages in the firelight. "What do you make of it, Holmes?" I asked. He was already at the chemical apparatus, and he turned to me with an expression in which the particular light of genuine intellectual engagement had replaced the grey fatigue of the preceding weeks. "I make of it, Watson, that someone has gone to very considerable trouble to produce an object which presents an appearance of one thing while being, in fact, quite another. The book was not stolen. It was not damaged. The pages were not torn out. It was returned intact and apparently useless to its proper place." He held a page briefly against the blue flame of the spirit lamp. "Observe, paper, my dear fellow, is in some respects more faithful than the men who write upon it. It remembers, even when it appears to have forgotten. Now, let me see what there is to be read in all this blankness." The fog pressed close against the windows of Baker Street as the night deepened, and I settled into my chair with my pipe and watched Holmes bend his singular energies upon those empty pages, quite certain that the investigation had begun in earnest. Chapter 2. The House in Bedford Square. The fog had thinned somewhat by the following evening, though it had not entirely relinquished its grip upon the city. It lingered in the lower streets and along the embankment in pale, trailing wisps, like the remnant of an argument which both parties have grown too weary to press. Holmes spent the greater part of that day at the Clerkenwell Records Office, from which he returned at 5:30, with the quiet, inward expression that told me he had found something worth examining, though he was not yet prepared to say what it was. He ate sparingly, spoke little, and spent an hour at the chemical apparatus before dressing himself in the neat, dark suit which he reserved for occasions requiring the appearance of conventional respectability. "Mr. Vale's supper party," he said, consulting the small card upon the mantelpiece. "Bedford Square, 8 o'clock. You will accompany me, Watson. It promises to be instructive, though not, I think, in the sense that Vale intends. You expect to learn something from the company? I expect the company to instruct me by precisely what it chooses not to say." He drew on his gloves with deliberate care. "Several of the persons most closely connected to this affair will be present this evening, and I find that a dinner table is, in many respects, more revealing environment than a witness's chair. Men and women on their guard in a formal interview will often abandon that guard entirely over fish course." Bedford Square presented a more reassuring aspect than Baker Street in such weather. The plane trees stood bare and dripping along the central garden railings, and the terrace of substantial Georgian houses on the northern side wore their customary air of legal and professional dignity, brass plates and lamplit fanlights suggesting a world in which order, precedent, and the measured transaction of serious business were the natural conditions of existence. Vale's house was of the middling size appropriate to a prosperous but not ostentatious solicitor, and the door was opened by a manservant of the elderly, soundless variety, who conveyed us upstairs with practised efficiency. The drawing-room in which we found ourselves was already occupied by 4 persons beside our host. Vale stood near the fireplace with a glass of sherry and the careful, composed expression of a man who has decided precisely how much anxiety he is prepared to show. Beside him stood a woman of perhaps 55 years, stout and elegantly dressed, broad, handsome face, and the kind of settled, watchful eyes which speak of a mind accustomed to calculating advantages. This, Vale introduced, Mrs. Eleanor Finch, widow of the late magistrate Aldous Finch, and a person, as he put it with diplomatic vagueness, closely connected to several of the legal matters under review. Mowbray was already present, standing with a glass of wine and conversing easily with a young man of 25 or thereabouts. Slight, dark-eyed, ink-stained fingers, and an air of nervous energy barely contained behind a tolerably good suit. This was Edgar Pell, junior clerk at the Clerkenwell Court, who shook our hands with a smile that did not entirely reach his eyes, and returned almost immediately to whatever Mowbray had been saying before our arrival. The sixth member of the party was introduced to me only as Vale's niece, Miss Lydia Vale, composed young woman of perhaps 28, brown-haired and clear-eyed, positioned herself near the window with a book which she had evidently set down only at our entrance, and which, I noticed, she did not move far from throughout the evening. She gave Holmes a single, direct look upon introduction, the look of someone who has formed an opinion and is reserving judgment upon whether it will require revision. We went down to supper at 8:30. The table was well appointed, and the cooking adequate, and the conversation followed the careful, circling pattern natural to a gathering of persons who share an uncomfortable subject and are united in their determination not to approach it directly. Vale steered discussion toward the season, the fog, the recent work of a particular barrister known to several around the table. Mrs. Finch held forth upon a disputed inheritance matter with the authority of one who considers her own interest in such questions entirely self-evident. Pell ate quickly, and drank rather more than was prudent, and laughed at remarks which were not intended to be amusing. Holmes, I observed, said remarkably little. He had placed himself where he could see the whole table without turning, and he attended to each speaker with the quality of stillness that I had long since learned to interpret, not as passive listening but as active collection. Twice I saw his gaze drop to Pell's cuffs, which bore fresh ink stains of the broad, irregular variety, produced not by the careful copying of documents, but by something handled in haste. Once, when Mrs. Finch mentioned a date connected to one of the disputed estate proceedings, he glanced up sharply, and I saw her repeat the date, and then immediately, almost without pause, correct herself with a laugh and a comment about her poor head for figures. Holmes returned his attention to his plate without expression. It was Mowbray who proved the most interesting study. He was easy, agreeable, precise in everything he said. When Holmes raised, as if in passing, a question about the administrative procedures for recording summonses, Bray answered it, fully, accurately, and with a readiness that slightly exceeded the requirements of the occasion. He had, I thought, the manner of a man who is prepared for an examination, and is quietly pleased to find the questions familiar. He volunteered the information that the Records Office had been under considerable pressure during the autumn, owing to a reorganization of filing procedures, and that this pressure might well have created conditions in which irregularities could pass undetected for longer than would ordinarily be the case. It was a natural and sensible observation. It was also, I reflected, a convenient one. After supper, while the gentlemen were left briefly with their port, and Vale had been drawn aside by Mowbray on some point of procedure, I found myself beside Miss Lydia Vale. She had scarcely spoken during the meal, and I had formed the impression of a woman who spoke only when she had something worth saying. "You are observing us all very carefully, Dr. Watson," she said, without preamble and without particular reproach. "Mr. Holmes is the observer," I replied. "I am merely his assistant in that respect." "Mr. Holmes has been watching Mr. Mowbray all evening," she said quietly. "He is right to do so, I think." She paused, and I sensed that she was deciding how much further to proceed. "My uncle is a good man, but he trusts professional competence, as though it were a substitute for character. There are things occurring within the records office which go beyond clerical irregularity. I do not know their precise nature, but I know that something is very wrong, and that it has been wrong for longer than anyone has yet acknowledged." Before I could press her, Vale had returned, and the opportunity passed. Holmes, I noticed, was now standing near the mantelpiece, apparently examining a small watercolour of no particular distinction, while Mowbray addressed some remark to Mrs. Finch as we made our farewells and descended to the street. Holmes was silent until we had walked some distance along the square. "Well, Watson," he said at last, "what did you make of the evening?" "Mowbray struck me as almost too helpful," I said. "Pell was nervous and drank too much, Mrs. Finch muddled a date she had every reason to know precisely, and Miss Vale—" "Miss Vale," Holmes interrupted, "is the only person at that table who came without a prepared position. She told you something, I think. I reported the exchange as faithfully as I could." Holmes listened without interrupting. "Good. That confirms one thing and opens another." He was quiet for a moment, his breath faintly visible in the damp air. "Tell me, Watson, when Mowbray discussed the reorganization of the filing procedures, did you notice how he held his wine-glass?" "He put it down," I said, after a moment's reflection. "He set it on the table before he began to speak, and he did not pick it up again until he had finished." "Precisely. A man in genuine anxiety about a professional embarrassment does not set down his glass before he answers a question. He holds it tighter." Bray set his glass down, because he was reciting, not responding. Long before I asked the questions, Holmes turned up his collar against the damp. "One further thing. Before I left the records office this afternoon, satisfied myself on one point which had been troubling me since last evening." "Which point was that?" "That the vanished summonses, all 43 of them, concern proceedings which were either postponed at the last moment or quietly dismissed before they could reach a hearing." He paused upon the pavement. "Cases which never arrived at a conclusion leave behind them the least documentary residue. They are the easiest to erase from the record, and the most difficult to reconstruct from memory. Removed those records, did not choose them at random, Watson. They were chosen because they shared a very particular quality. I begin to think that quality had less to do with the debtors named in the summonses than with the witnesses accused." He said nothing further on the subject that evening, but as I lay wakeful in the small hours, listening to the last of the fog drip from the eaves, found his final words returning to me with the insistence of something not yet fully understood. Chapter 3. The Vanishing Record. 2 mornings after the supper at Bedford Square. I was at breakfast, and Holmes was standing at the window in his dressing gown when Mrs. Hudson brought up the morning papers along with a note delivered by hand. Holmes read the note first, set it upon the table without comment, and then opened the utmost newspaper with a deliberate care, which told me the note had contained something he had already, in some measure, anticipated. "There has been a death," he said. I set down my cup. "Connected to our matter?" "A moneylender named Caleb Dorr, with offices near Chancery Lane. He was found this morning in his private room by his clerk." The door was locked from the inside. A window, giving onto a rear courtyard, stood open. The police have drawn the obvious conclusion. He passed me the paper and returned to the window. Gregson will be there by now. I have been asked to attend. I had encountered Inspector Gregson of Scotland Yard on several previous occasions and had formed a tolerably consistent impression of him. A tall, fair man of considerable energy and genuine professional pride, whose limitation lay not in his industry, but in a tendency to select the most available explanation, and then arrange his facts around it, with the confidence of a man who mistakes the first answer for the correct one. He was, as Holmes once remarked to me privately, at his best when the evidence was unambiguous, and at his worst when it required him to question his own certainties. He greeted us at the door of Dawes' office building in Chancery Lane, with the satisfied expression of a man who considers the case already settled. "Suicide," he said as we ascended the narrow stair. Clear enough, the man had debts of his own, whatever his occupation, and it appears he was facing proceedings he could not comfortably survive. His clerk says he had been in a state of agitation for a week past. "Spoken with the clerk already," said Holmes. "First thing. A reliable man, been with Daw 12 years. He heard nothing in the night, but noticed the light still burning under the door at 7 this morning when he arrived, which he thought peculiar. The door was bolted on the inside, as I said. We had to force it. The room was small and close, the particular atmosphere of a place from which fresh air has long been excluded by preference rather than necessity. In short, a man who conducted transactions he preferred to keep private. A heavy desk occupied the centre, set about with ledgers and correspondence in the ordered disorder of active commerce. A fireplace on the near wall held the grey remnant of a recent fire, and before the desk, in a leather chair, which had been pulled slightly away from its natural position, sat the mortal remains of Caleb Daw, a lean, sallow man of perhaps 60, whose expression in death conveyed less of peace than of some unresolved consternation. Near the body, on the edge of the desk, lay a fragment of burnt paper, perhaps 3 inches square. A confession, Gregson explained, had been partially destroyed in the grate. This was all that remained. He held it out with the air of a man presenting his most compelling exhibit, and I took it and examined it. It was heavier stock than ordinary writing paper, with a faint printed border along one surviving edge, official paper of some kind, clearly. The writing upon the surviving fragment was not a confession at all. So far as I could determine, proportion of a formal legal notice. Holmes had moved past us both, and was conducting his own examination of the room with the unhurried, systematic method I knew well. The grate, straightening to consider the desk, moving to the open window and leaning out briefly to survey the courtyard below. He said nothing for several minutes. Gregson watched him with the tolerant impatience of a man who has learned that these performances occasionally produce useful results. "The ash," Holmes said at last, straightening from the fireplace. "You say a confession was burned here." "Partially burned, yes. Draught must have caught the remainder before it could catch fully." "What kind of paper produces an ash as fine as this?" Holmes held a small quantity on his fingertip for Gregson's inspection. "Ordinary writing paper, even the best quality, leaves a coarser residue. This is the ash of paper that has been treated. Sized differently from standard stock, or subjected to some chemical process." He moved to the desk and examined the pen and inkstand. "Daw wrote his confession, you say, and then burned it in a moment of irresolution, preserving only this fragment by accident. Look at the pen nib, Gregson." Gregson looked. What of it? It is perfectly clean. A man who has written a document of any length. The kind of length one associates with a confession adequate to explain a suicide, does not leave a clean nib. He blots, he pauses, he scratches. There is no ink upon the nib, none in the tray, and the inkstand, if you will notice, is not the inkstand of a man who wrote anything this morning. It has dust. Gregson's expression did not change, but something shifted fractionally behind his eyes. The man was in a state of distress. He may have used another pen. He may have written the thing last night. He may, said Holmes, agreeably. He had moved along the wall to where a bell pull hung beside the desk, and he examined it briefly, lifting it and allowing it to fall. Did the clerk mention where the door rang for anything yesterday evening? He did not. No. He would not have rung, because the bell pull has been cut and reteed. Holmes indicated the point, perhaps 18 inches above the tassel, where the fabric showed a faint irregularity, the slight thickening of a knot concealed beneath the woven cover. Not cut recently, the fibres at the join have had time to settle, but cut within the last fortnight, think, and retied by someone who wished the fact to go unnoticed. He turned from the wall with the composed air of a man who has finished reading a page. Well, Gregson, I think we have seen enough for the present. On the pavement outside, Gregson lingered with us for a moment before taking his leave. He was not, I will say, entirely without the capacity for doubt. He looked back up at the building with the expression of a man reviewing a proposition he had considered settled. The bell pull, he said. There may be an innocent explanation. There may be several, said Holmes. The ash and the pen nib are, I think, less amenable to innocent explanation. But pursue your present theory by all means, Gregson. It will be instructive to see how far it carries you. When Gregson had gone, I fell into step beside Holmes as he turned toward the Strand. The morning had produced a watery, reluctant sun, which did little to warm the air, and served chiefly to illuminate the grime upon the buildings and the weariness upon the faces of past us. He did not die by his own hand, I said. It was not a question. He did not. The arrangement of the scene was competent, but not inspired. The locked door presents a difficulty only until one examines the bolt. It is of the sliding variety, operable from outside by a thin implement passed through the gap at the frame's edge. The open window is a theatrical detail, suggests flight. It actually indicates that whoever arranged matters wished us to conclude it's either suicide or an intruder's hasty departure. Holmes turned up his collar against the wind off the river. What it does not explain is the fragment of official court paper beside the body. Coincidence? Dorr was himself connected to the court proceedings. I do not, as you are aware, place great confidence in coincidence. Point. Holmes was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the middle distance in the way they assumed when thought was running faster than speech. Dorr claimed never to have received a summons. He was among those whose case appeared in the missing records. And now Dorr is dead, and beside him lies a fragment of official court paper, which has been subjected to the same chemical treatment as the pages of the blank summons book. He paused at the corner, and I saw upon his face not the satisfaction of a theory confirmed, but the particular alertness of a man who has found, in the place we're expected to find, one question answered, two new questions waiting. Someone, Watson, wished Dorr silenced, but they also wished to leave a message, or perhaps a warning, in the form of that fragment. For whom the warning was intended cannot yet say with certainty. He hailed a cab with a raised hand and turned to me as it drew up. But I begin to think that we are not the only parties in this affair who are conducting an investigation. Chapter 4. Footprints in Dust. It is one of the more peculiar privileges of association with Sherlock Holmes that one finds oneself, at hours when respectable persons are long abed, standing in cold and darkened buildings, conducting examinations, which would, in any other context, require a degree of explanation to the local constabulary. The Clerkenwell Records Office was such a building, and the hour at which we entered it, by arrangement with Vale, who had procured a key with rather less difficulty than the undertaking deserved, was a few minutes past 11 on a Thursday night. Holmes had spent the intervening day in a manner which I could reconstruct only partially, had been out before I rose, and had returned briefly at midday to collect certain items from his chemical apparatus, and had reappeared at 9:30 in the evening with a quantity of fine grey dust upon his left sleeve, and the focused, private expression which told me he had arrived at a conclusion he was not yet prepared to share. He ate nothing, drank 2 cups of strong tea, and at 10 o'clock stood and announced that we were going to Clerkenwell. The building which housed the Records Office occupied the upper floors of a narrow structure in a lane running parallel to the court itself. A lane which collected the fog in the evenings and apparently retained it through the morning, for even now thin, cold mist clung to the cobbles and deadened our footsteps as we approached. Within, the building smelled of old paper, lamp oil, particular damp of stone walls that have absorbed a century of London winters. Holmes lit the small dark lantern he had brought and moved ahead of me up the stair without hesitation, having apparently memorized the layout during his authorized visit 2 days prior. The records room occupied the second floor. A long, low chamber lined on 3 sides with shelving, and fitted down its centre with 2 broad tables for the examination of documents. The shelves bore their ledgers, summons books, correspondence folders, and registration volumes in the orderly sequence of an administration which took its own procedures seriously. In the thin beam of Holmes's lantern, the spines of the volumes cast long, repeated shadows up the wall. He went immediately to the far corner of the room, where a heavy oak cabinet of the locked variety stood somewhat apart from the shelving. He crouched before it, and directed the lantern beam along the floor at an oblique angle, in the manner of a man examining a surface for the relief of its irregularities, rather than its general appearance. "Come and look at this," he said quietly, and I crouched beside him. At that angle, the uneven distribution of the dust upon the floorboards was unmistakable. Before the cabinet, a space perhaps 2 feet wide and 18 inches deep had been disturbed, dust compressed and scuffed, in a way which spoke of repeated standing. Weight shifted from foot to foot, the small, unconscious movements of a person occupied with something requiring sustained tension. The disturbance was not fresh. It had the settled quality of marks made some days, or perhaps a week past, undisturbed since. "Someone stood here regularly," I said. "Stood?" Here, at night, without the ordinary light of the office, which would have made the work visible to anyone in the lane below. He moved the lantern to illuminate the cabinet's lock. The lock has been worked repeatedly, with a key that does not belong to it. You see the fine scoring on the brass plate? A fitted key produces no such marks. This lock was opened with a copy, good enough to function, not quite precise enough to enter without friction. He straightened and turned his attention to the shelves. He moved along them slowly, holding the lantern close to the ledger spines, and about 2/3 of the way along the central section he stopped and drew out a volume, a summons registration ledger of the standard pattern, and examined it briefly before replacing it. Then he drew it out again and handed it to me. "Hold it naturally," he said, "as you would to open it and consult the interior." I did so. The spine bent readily in the direction I applied, binding flexing, with the ease of a book, accustomed to being opened in that fashion. "Now turn it around and open it from the other end." Resistance was immediately apparent. The binding reluctant, the spine stiffening perceptibly before yielding. It was the small, unmistakable quality of a book shelved backwards, with its spine facing inward for a period long enough that the binding had accommodated itself to being opened from what was now its back rather than its front. It was reversed on the shelf, I said. Replaced in haste, or by someone unaccustomed to the particular order of this library. A regular clerk would replace it correctly, without thought. The act would be as automatic as closing a door. Someone unfamiliar with the routine, or hurried, or working in insufficient light, reversed it. Holmes took the volume from me and tilted it, directing the lantern at the floor directly beneath the shelf. On the boards below, a small disc of congealed wax, perhaps the size of a shilling, had set in a slight depression between two planks. He used a candle at some point, not on every visit, perhaps, but on at least one occasion when the lantern was insufficient or unavailable. We moved to the central table, where Holmes set the lantern down and produced from his coat pocket a folded paper containing a small quantity of the grey dust I had noticed on his sleeve earlier. He tipped a portion of this beside a corresponding sample scraped carefully from the cabinet's lower shelf, and examined both through the small lens he habitually carried. The chemical which removed the writing from the summons pages leaves a secondary residue, he said without looking up. Detectable only if one knows what to look for, and then only under magnification or in concentrated quantity. Found traces of it yesterday in the Chancery Lane office, on the edge of Dawes' desk, where the court paper fragment had rested. He straightened. "I find it here as well, on the lower shelf of this cabinet. Whatever was done to those summons pages was done, at least in part, in this room." I looked about the silent offices. The ranked ledgers, the orderly tables, the frosted windows, through which the lane's lamplight fell in pale, distorted oblongs. It was difficult to reconcile the room's administrative solemnity with the quiet, systematic violation that had evidently been conducted within it. "The cases that were erased," I said. "You mentioned that the connection lay with the witnesses, not the debtors." "I did, and I have now confirmed it." Holmes folded the paper and returned it to his pocket. "I spent this morning examining the case records for the 12 months preceding the missing period. Of the 43 vanished summonses, 31 list witnesses or affiliated parties who appear in at least one other proceeding, a proceeding which, in every instance, touches upon questions of certified documentation. Signatures witnessed, declarations attested, the authenticity of formal instruments." He paused, and in the stillness of the room the distant tolling of a church bell reached us through the glass, measuring the quarter hour with unhurried impartiality. "Someone has spent considerable effort erasing every legal record in which a particular class of documentation might come under scrutiny. I have been turning over since yesterday as this." He moved to the window and stood for a moment looking down at the lane, his back to me and his hands clasped behind him in the attitude of concentrated reflection. "The erasure is meticulous. Chemistry is sophisticated. The access required intimate knowledge of this office and its procedures. And yet, he turned, Pell. Edgar Pell, junior clerk, with his gambling debts and his ink-stained cuffs and his frank, evident nervousness. Do you believe Pell capable of this, Watson? This degree of patience, precision, and sustained concealment? I considered the young man I had observed at the supper table, his darting eyes, his unguarded laugh, the way his hand had gone repeatedly to his wine-glass, and away again in the manner of someone struggling with a habit of anxiety. No, I said, I do not, nor do I, which means that Pell's role in this affair, whatever it amounts to, is secondary. He is a thread in the pattern, not the hand that wove it. Holmes took up the lantern and moved toward the door. And there is one further thing. Come here before we leave. He directed the beam at the jamb of the records room door, at a point level with the handle. Pressed into the wood so lightly as to be invisible without directed light was the faint impression of a thumb. Broad, slightly elongated at the tip, with a whorl pattern that pressed deeper on the inner edge. Made by someone pulling the door closed from within, Holmes said. Someone taking care, as they left, to make no noise. He extinguished the lantern as we reached the landing. File that impression in your memory, Watson. We shall have occasion to compare it before long. We descended in darkness and let ourselves out into the lane. The mist had thickened again, and the lamplight in the court beyond was reduced to a dim, uncertain smear. Holmes walked in silence for some minutes, and when he spoke, his voice had the quality of a man who has confirmed one proposition and found it opening directly onto another. Criminal I am seeking, he said, is not primarily greedy, Watson. Greed produces a different kind of crime. Broader, less selective, more improvised. This has been conducted like a campaign, with a specific objective, and a willingness to do whatever is required to protect a single, carefully constructed thing. He turned up his collar and glanced briefly at the sky, where no stars were visible through the cloud. That thing is, I think I can now say with reasonable confidence. What I cannot yet say is precisely how deep the roots of it go. We shall find out. He said nothing further as we walked to find a cab. And I did not press him. The cold settled around us. The city went about its indifferent, nocturnal business. And I turned the evening's evidence over in my mind with the uneasy conviction that the affair was growing more serious and more dangerous than its origin in a blank book of court records had given any of us reason to expect. Chapter 5. The Silent Reconstruction. There are days in Baker Street which pass in a kind of suspended quiet, unremarkable on their surface, yet charged, in retrospect, with the particular significance of things being decided below the level of the visible. Friday, following our night visit to Clerkenwell, was such a day. Holmes rose before 7, which was itself unusual, and by the time I came down to breakfast, he had already cleared one end of the dining table and arranged upon it a series of materials whose connection to one another I could not immediately determine. 3 glass dishes, a small brass spirit lamp, a roll of blotting paper, several squares of the heavy official paper he had obtained from the records office, 3 small stoppered bottles, small stottos, labels I recognised as belonging to his chemical stores. Paused. He did not speak at breakfast beyond a monosyllabic acknowledgement of my presence. He ate mechanically, his eyes on the table, and before I had finished my second cup of tea, he had risen and begun his experiments with the focused, unreachable concentration of a man for whom the external world has temporarily ceased to hold any claim. I had seen him. in this condition often enough to know that interruption was neither welcome nor productive, and so I took my hat and coat and attended to certain professional calls which had been waiting several days for my attention, leaving him to his silence and his chemical residues. I returned at 2:30 to find the sitting room bearing the evidence of a morning's sustained intellectual labour. A faint smell of acid and burnt paper. Several sheets covered in Holmes's compact, angular handwriting. Holmes himself in his armchair with his legs extended and his fingertips together, staring at the ceiling in the attitude of a man who has arrived somewhere and is now examining where he stands. "Sit down, Watson," he said, without looking at me. "I want to think aloud, and you are useful to me as a check upon my own reasoning." I settled into my chair and waited. "The chemical used to remove the writing from the summons pages," he began, "is a compound I have now identified with reasonable certainty. It is not a common preparation. It requires a degree of chemical knowledge beyond the amateur, and it is not obtainable through ordinary commercial channels. It is used professionally in the restoration of documents, and occasionally preparation of certain legal stationery, where partial erasure is a required function. The number of suppliers in London who stock the necessary components is small. I have spent the morning satisfying myself on that point and on one further question, which was, whether the compound could be applied to already written pages without leaving any trace visible to ordinary inspection, and yet leave the paper superficially cleaner than its surroundings. He lowered his gaze from the ceiling. The answer is yes, under specific conditions. The paper must be treated within a certain period after the original writing. Not immediately, but within some weeks. And the process requires time, care, and access to a dry, moderately warm environment. The records office cabinet, I noted, stands beside a chimney wall. In autumn, with the building in regular use, it would be consistently warm on its interior face. Turn this over for a moment. The cabinet was both the storage place and, in effect, the workshop. Precisely so. The records were treated in situ, replaced, and the cabinet relocked. No volume was removed from the office. No materials were brought in quantity. The entire operation was conducted with what I can only describe as a professional economy of means. He rose abruptly and moved to the mantelpiece, taking his pipe from the rack. "Which returns me to Pell. You said at Clerkenwell that Pell was not capable of this." "I said he was not the primary intelligence behind it." "That is not the same thing." He filled his pipe with the deliberate, unhurried motion of a man arranging his thoughts alongside his actions. "Pell accepted money from debtors to delay the issuing of certain court notices. That is a separate corruption, crude, opportunistic, and entirely consistent with his character. Pell also had unrestricted access to the records office, including after hours. He is, in short, precisely the kind of peripheral figure a more careful criminal would find useful. Visible enough to attract attention, compromised enough to be controlled, and frightened enough. Nuffnats. When caught, to confess only to what he himself has done, without necessarily connecting it to the larger design." "A decoy," I said. "A convenient one, consciously deployed as such. I am not yet entirely certain." He lit the pipe and stood for a moment at the window. "This morning, I also spoke with 3 former recipients of court summonses, whose records appear among the missing 43. In each case the same pattern emerged. The summons concerned a proceeding in which some form of witnessed or attested document was a central piece of evidence. In each case the proceeding was delayed and then quietly dropped. And in each case I pressed the recipient on the question of who had informed them of the postman. The answer was a verbal notice delivered in person by a court official. Court official they described in terms consistent with a man of middle age, quietly dressed, possessed of considerable professional authority. I set down my cup. Mowbray. The descriptions are suggestive, but not conclusive. I do not present them as identification. He turned from the window. But consider what this means if it is so. The summonses were issued, recorded, delivered. Not by post, but personally by the same individual who subsequently erased the record of their issuance. The recipients believed themselves properly notified. They attended, or prepared to attend, and were then turned away with assurances of rescheduling that never came. The written record vanished. From the court's perspective, the summons was never served. From the recipient's perspective, they had done everything required of them. The proceeding simply ceased to exist. The elegance of it was, in its way, genuinely impressive. The kind of construction which inspires a reluctant admiration, even as one appreciates purpose. But to what end? I said. What was protected by all this? Holmes looked at me steadily. That is the question upon which everything turns, and I am not yet prepared to answer it with the confidence I require. He crossed to the table and picked up one of the sheets of his morning's notes. What I can say is this. This afternoon I received a visit. You were out. From Miss Lydia Vale. I had not expected that. Here? She came to Baker Street? She did, and alone, which I thought showed considerable resolution. She brought with her something she had found among her uncle's papers the previous evening, memorandum, partially burned, which she had retrieved from the fireplace. Great. In his study, where it had evidently been placed for destruction, but had not caught fully. He produced from the table a small folded paper, charred along one edge and across the lower half, and handed it to me. The surviving portion contained perhaps 6 lines of close, careful handwriting in a clerical hand. The handwriting of a man accustomed to producing clear, formal text. The content was fragmentary. References to case numbers, a date in September of the prior year, and on the 3rd line, surname preceded by what appeared to be the letter M. The remainder of the word lost to the fire. Below that, separated by a ruled line, brief phrase. Original instrument. Certified under former. Then nothing. The remainder was gone. The hand, I said slowly. I have seen this hand before. Where? I looked up. The summons book. The endorsements on the inside cover. The administrative notations. The same precise, slightly forward-leaning character. Holmes took the fragment back with a quiet satisfaction which he kept, as was his habit, largely off his face. Yes, I reached the same conclusion within 30 seconds of Miss Vale placing it in my hand, which means that Vale himself had obtained by some means document prepared or annotated by the same person who treated the summons pages, and that someone, learning of this, attempted to destroy it. He moved to his chair and sat down heavily. Vale is in more danger than he knows, Watson. I shall see him tomorrow and advise him accordingly, though I suspect he will resist the suggestion that he is at risk. And the surname on the 3rd line, the M. Holmes settled back and drew on his pipe. I have 3 candidates and 1 certainty. The certainty is that whoever bears that name has spent several years constructing a respectable professional identity over the foundations of something he would very greatly prefer the world not to examine. He closed his eyes. The candidates I shall reduce to 1 by Monday. Until then, I should be grateful if you would review from memory every occasion on which Adrian Mowbray has spoken in our presence, consider whether any single thing he told us was said in answer to a question, or whether it was all, every word of it, said in anticipation of one. I sat with that thought for the remainder of the evening and found, more carefully I reviewed the matter, that the answer was not comfortable. Chapter 6. A Name Half Erased. Holmes was gone the whole of Saturday, and the better part of Sunday, which was not in itself unusual. But the manner of his absence was, he left no note, took no cab that I observed, and returned on Sunday evening in a state which I can only describe as quietly electric. The state of a man who has been moving through cold, unrewarding country, and has at last come upon the road he was looking for. Boots were muddied to the ankle. His coat carried the smell of railway smoke, and, faintly, of the particular damp stone of provincial buildings. He ate a full supper for the first time in several days, and he spoke throughout it of nothing more pertinent than a monograph he wished to consult, the London Library, which I understood to mean that whatever he had found, he was not yet ready to assemble it into words. I waited. It was, after long practice, an easier thing to do than it had once been. It was not until Monday morning, over coffee, that he set down his cup and said, with the directness that signalled the end of a period of private deliberation, Adrian Mowbray was not born Adrian Mowbray. I looked at him across the table. His name, until approximately 9 years ago, was Andrew Mears. He practised as a law clerk in the county of Shropshire, in a market town called Whitmore, under the employment of a firm of solicitors now dissolved. During the period of his employment there, the firm became involved in a series of property transactions in which the witnessed signatures upon transfer instruments were subsequently found to be irregular. In 2 cases, demonstrably forged. Holmes refilled his cup with the unhurried precision of a man who has arranged his facts and can now afford to present them in order. Junior partner of the firm was prosecuted and acquitted on a technicality. 2 clerks left the county before the inquiry concluded. One of those clerks was Andrew Mears, and Mears became Mowbray. In London, where no one knew him, references from a solicitor in Birmingham who has since died. And with the interval of approximately 18 months apparently spent abroad, in Belgium, I believe, though I have not yet confirmed that detail. He entered the Clerkenwell Court administrations 7 years ago as a junior clerk, Rose. By virtue of demonstrable competence and an entirely blameless professional record to his present position, Holmes set down the coffee cup. He is, by every account I have been able to gather, genuinely good at his work. That is not an irrelevant detail. It is in fact central to the entire design. Because a man who is genuinely good at his work attracts less scrutiny. Because a man who is genuinely good at his work, and who has buried his past under 7 years of impeccable conduct, has an enormous amount to lose if that past resurfaces. The terror of exposure, Watson, proportional to the distance one has travelled from the thing being concealed. Man who has been respectable for a month fears exposure rather less than a man who has been respectable for 7 years and has constructed his entire present existence upon the assumption that the past is safely interred. He rose from the table and moved to the window, standing with his hands in his dressing-gown pockets in the way he had when thought was still running ahead of conclusion. Jonas Kettering, the imprisoned forger. I mentioned him to you at the beginning of this affair. Vale mentioned him. You noted the connection. Kettering was convicted 4 years ago of forging legal instruments, specifically. witnessed transfer documents in property matters. He had previously worked, before his London career, as a law clerk in the Midlands. Holmes turned in Shropshire. The implications settled into place with the quiet finality of a bolt drawn home. Mowbray and Kettering knew each other, clerks. They were clerks in the same county at the same period, though not, so far as I can establish, in the same firm. But the techniques involved in the Whitmore irregularities, and those for which Kettering was subsequently convicted in London, are sufficiently similar to suggest a shared education in method, if not a formal partnership. When Kettering was arrested, his associates dispersed. Mowbray, by then established at Clerkenwell, was sufficiently remote from the London operation to escape attention. But the connection existed, and the risk of its discovery existed with it. Holmes returned to his chair, sat forward with his forearms upon his knees, his grey eyes direct and unusually sober. Now several of those old proceedings were coming up for administrative review. The court was reorganising its filing procedures. Mowbray himself told us that you will recall with considerable readiness that reorganisation would inevitably involve a systematic examination of historical records, Horst, and among those records were cases in which the very class of witnessed tested documentation that formed the basis of both the Whitmore irregularities and Kettering's London operations might, under scrutiny, raise questions that led backward, to Mears, to Whitmore, to the connection with Kettering. I found myself reviewing, in the light of all this, a figure I had observed at the Bedford Square supper. The pleasant face, the set-down wine-glass, the answers prepared before the questions arrived. "He has been planning this for some time," I said. This was not a hasty response to a sudden threat. He is not a hasty man. That is precisely what makes him so formidable, and ultimately traceable. The hasty criminal leaves obvious errors. Mowbray has left almost none. Almost. Holmes reached into the pocket of his dressing gown and produced the folded paper containing his chemical notes, but did not open it. Simply held it, as though the physical object were a useful anchor for his thinking. On Saturday I travelled to Whitmore and spent 6 hours in the offices of the local newspaper and the county records registry. Sunday, I paid a visit to a retired solicitor in Shrewsbury who had been peripherally connected to the inquiry 9 years ago, and who has, in the intervening period, had considerable leisure in which to think about what he saw. He was a cautious man. Cautious men often are, after they have once been burned by incaution. But he was not entirely unwilling to talk. "What did he tell you?" "He told me that Andrew Mears was quiet, capable and thorough, that he had always seemed somewhat older than his years, that during the inquiry he had expressed appropriate shock, and appropriate cooperation, with appropriate timing throughout." Holmes allowed a brief, dry pause. "He also told me that in the weeks before the irregularities came to light, Mears had been seen in correspondence with a man from London, whose name the solicitor did not know, but whose description, broad, slightly heavy, with a habit of wearing a distinctive style of dark overcoat, is consistent, to a degree I find more than coincidental, Kettering's known appearance." I absorbed this in silence. Outside, the Monday morning traffic of Baker Street carried on its ordinary commerce. A cart horse clopping, a costermonger's distant cry, the rattle of iron wheels on the November-hardened road. The ordinary world conducting its ordinary business, entirely ignorant of the quiet, careful architecture of deception which Holmes had spent the weekend patiently dismantling. "You said last week," I ventured, "that crimes of intellect depend less upon greed than upon terror. Does that hold? Given what you have now found, forgeries at Whitmore, that was greed, surely. Holmes considered this for a moment. The forgeries were greed, yes, and youth, and the moral flexibility of a young man who had not yet constructed a self he valued. But what we are dealing with now, the erasure, the silence, Doyle's death, these belong to a different order of motivation entirely. They are the acts of a man protecting not money but identity, heart. He is not the young clerk at Whitmore any longer. He has made himself into something else, something he believes in. Prospect of its destruction is, to him, a kind of annihilation. Holmes set down the paper. That is what makes him dangerous, Watson. Cunning alone. But the particular desperation of a man who has something irreplaceable to lose. That evening, Holmes had gone out briefly to send two telegrams, whose content he did not share with me. I sat by the fire with the blank summons book in my lap. Holmes had left it on the side table, and turned its pale, empty pages in the firelight. He returned an hour later, hung his coat, and without preamble, crossed to where the book lay in a chair, and held one of the pages close to the blue spirit flame of the small lamp on the chemical table, tilting it precisely. Then he was still for a moment, and in the stillness I saw upon his face the expression that I had learned, over many years, to value above all others, the expression of a man who has found the one thing that was not supposed to be there. He set the book down and smiled, not at me, but at some private resolution forming in his own mind. As I suspected, he said, the pressure marks. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. For I had learned, equally well, that elaboration would come, at precisely the moment of his choosing, and not a moment before. The obvious solution. The newspapers made up their minds on Wednesday. I read them that morning over breakfast, while Holmes sat behind his own paper in a silence, which I had come to recognise as the particular silence of man declining to comment on something that irritates him. The evening editions of Monday and the morning editions of Tuesday had contented themselves with reporting Doyle's death as a probable suicide and noting, in the cautious language of editors who understand the law of libel, certain irregularities in the records of a metropolitan magistrate's court were under investigation. By Wednesday, however, restraint had dissolved. 2 papers named Pell directly. A third described, in terms that left little genuine ambiguity, corrupt junior clerk who had systematically falsified legal records for profit, and threatened with discovery by a moneylender who had pieced together the scheme, had silenced him. Permanently, the narrative was, I must concede, coherent and satisfying in the way that simple explanations tend to be satisfying. It moved from cause to effect without hesitation. It assigned a clear and comprehensible motive, and it required nothing of the reader beyond a willingness to accept that the obvious answer was the correct one. Holmes set down his paper and reached for the coffee. They have him convicted, tried, transported before Gregson has finished writing his report, he said. I wonder sometimes whether journalism and detection are not, at their foundations, incompatible vocations. The detective cannot afford to require one at all. Gregson will be pleased, I said. Gregson is pleased. I received a note from him last evening which I neglected to mention. He has found marked banknotes among Pell's personal effects. 3 £5 notes whose serial numbers correspond to funds known to have been held by 2 of the debtors named in the missing summonses. Pell, it appears, did not even have the elementary caution to spend what he was given. Holmes paused, turning his coffee cup in its saucer. Gregson considers this decisive, and you do not. I consider it consistent with what I already knew about Pell, namely, that he accepted money to delay certain court notices, he was careless with the proceeds, and that he is precisely the kind of secondary figure a more careful man would use as a visible target of opportunity. He set the cup down with a faint, deliberate click. The banknotes prove that Pell took bribes, prove nothing whatever about who erased the records, who obtained the chemical compound, who had a key copied for that cabinet, or who was in Zor's office on the night Dor died. I turned the newspaper over so that Pell's name, in its bold, accusing type, faced the table. Will you tell Gregson what you know? I shall tell him what I am prepared to tell him at the appropriate moment. In the meantime, telling him would be worse than useless. He has his case, Watson. It is a tolerably good case against a tolerably guilty man for a portion of the offence. If I present him now with Andrew Mears and Whitmore and Kettering and forged instruments and a 9-year-old buried identity, he will do one of two things. Either he will dismiss it as elaboration upon a settled matter, which will give Mowbray time to remove himself, will charge at it directly, which will give Mowbray time to remove himself rather more quickly. Holmes picked up the summons book from the side table, where it had lain since Monday evening, and set it squarely on the breakfast table between us. No. We proceed as we are until I have everything I need. I looked at the book, its official green cover, its damnably blank pages, had sat in our rooms for nearly a week. And in that week it had, under Holmes's examination, accumulated a significance wholly disproportionate to its appearance. The pressure marks, I said. You mentioned them on Monday night and have said nothing since. Holmes opened the book to a page, roughly in the third quarter, one of the pages, whose surface appeared, to ordinary inspection, as smoothly virginal as new writing paper. He tilted it at a shallow angle toward the window light and handed it to me. I looked, and after a moment I saw them. Faint, almost imperceptible impressions in the paper. Not the broad, even indentation of a writing hand, but the precise, narrow traces of lettering pressed through from a page above. The ghost of words that had once existed on the preceding leaf before the preceding leaf was treated and cleaned. The impressions ran across the page in a pattern consistent with the standard format of a court summons. The individual letters were largely illegible. Too faint, too fragmentary, but the structure of the thing was unmistakable. The numbering, particular, was clear enough. The series stamps applied to each summons at issue were pressed with sufficient force to transfer their impression through multiple pages. The pages were written upon, I said. The writing was removed, but the act of writing, the physical pressure of it, could not be chemically erased because the compound affects the surface, not the body of the paper. Just so. A falsehood operating upon the surface of a thing leaves the structure of the truth intact beneath. Holmes retrieved the book and closed it with a quiet care, which means that I can establish, beyond any reasonable challenge, these pages once contained writing consistent in format, with official court summonses numbered in sequence, issued within the period veil specified. The book is not blank because it was never written in, is blank because someone wished it to appear so, and believed that chemical treatment of the surface was sufficient to accomplish that wish. He returned the book to the side table. They forgot or did not know. That paper carries more memory than its surface. There was a pause, during which the sounds of the street rose and fell with their habitual indifference to our concerns. "You said on Sunday that Mowbray is dangerous," I said, with a slight hesitation which I attribute to the fact that the thought which followed it was one I had been turning over for 2 days without quite bringing myself to voice it. Dor presumably became dangerous to him as well. When did Dor learn the truth? Holmes looked at me with an expression which contained, I thought, a measure of approval that he was too guarded to express more directly. "That is precisely the right question, and I have been working toward it for 3 days. My present belief is that Dor did not uncover anything. Rather, something was brought to Dor's attention, deliberately, by a party who wished to use Dor's vulnerability to apply pressure to Mowbray." He leaned back in his chair. "Dor was a moneylender. Among his clients, in all probability, were individuals who also had business before the court. A moneylender in possession of information about a senior court official. The kind of information that could end a career and begin a prosecution is not merely a curious bystander. He is a potential instrument of blackmailer, who has identified his target, does not remain a threat that a man of Mowbray's temperament would permit to persist." "Then Dor was not simply silenced because he knew too much," I said, slowly. "He was silenced because someone arranged for him to know just enough." Holmes was still for a moment, and I saw in his expression the slight, almost involuntary quality of recognition that crosses a man's face when someone else has, unexpectedly, completed a sentence he had not yet finished writing. "That possibility has been in my mind since Friday," he said quietly. "If it is correct, this affair has a dimension we have not yet fully mapped. Someone, Watson, a party we have not yet clearly identified, introduced the information to Dor. Someone lit the fuse, knowing what it would ignite." He rose and went to the mantelpiece, where he stood looking at the Persian slipper that served as his tobacco store. Without, I thought, seeing it at all, question is whether that party intended Dor's death, he continued, half to himself, or whether they miscalculated the force of what they had set in motion. He turned. "Miss Vale told you that something unnatural had been occurring within the records office. I did not at the time. Press that word, unnatural. I have been pressing it since. She is an observant woman who uses language with care. She did not say irregular, or suspicious, or wrong. She said unnatural, by which I think she meant something that had acquired, over time, the appearance of normality, while remaining, in its essence, violation of what ought to be." He reached, at last, for the tobacco, and the slight relaxation of his bearing told me that the period of close, exclusive thought was giving way to the phase that followed it. The phase in which accumulated understanding begins to resolve into action. "I shall see Mowbray tomorrow," Holmes said, packing his pipe with measured deliberation. "Privately, and without forewarning him through Vale. I wish to take his measure in a direct exchange, now that I hold rather more of the picture than I did at Bedford Square." He paused. "And I wish, Watson, to observe his hands." "His hands?" "I left a thumbprint on the door jamb of the records room last Thursday night." He struck a match, not my own. Chapter 8. The Lamplighter's Evidence. Holmes left Baker Street the following morning before I had come down to breakfast, did not return until well past midnight. I know the hour precisely because I had given up waiting for him at 11. Gone to bed, was lying wakeful in that frustrating intermediate state between concern and irritation when I heard his step on the stair, a heavier tread than usual, with the particular quality of controlled fatigue that a man produces when he is tired, and does not wish to appear so. Door opened and closed. Silence resumed. At breakfast he appeared with soot along the left side of his jaw, which he had evidently not noticed, prot, and with the expression of a man who has worked through the night on a problem, and arrived somewhere he had not entirely anticipated. He ate with purpose, and drank 3 cups of coffee, in a manner that suggested the previous day had made significant demands upon his physical reserves, which was unusual. Holmes, in the full engagement of a case, was ordinarily impervious to ordinary fatigue, only when a case had required not brilliance but persistence, the grinding, unglamorous persistence of cold lanes and reluctant witnesses and repeated, fruitless inquiry, that he showed its weight. I said nothing about the soot until he reached for the milk jug, and I could see, on the inner edge of his right cuff, a corresponding smear. "Chimney?" I said. He glanced at his cuff with mild surprise, as if discovering a minor cartographic error on a familiar map. "Roof, actually. The lane behind the Clerkenwell Record's office is narrow enough that the buildings on either side effectively share their upper stories in poor visibility. If one wishes to observe the rear approach to a building without being observed in return, the adjacent roof presents itself as the logical position." He set down the jug. "I was there from 10 o'clock until shortly after 2 in the morning. Nothing of immediate relevance occurred at the records office. However, the time was not wasted. You found the lamplighter." He looked at me briefly. "I had found him yesterday afternoon, before the roof. I was merely confirming, during those 4 hours of admirable cold and discomfort, that the account he gave me was consistent with the physical geography of the location." He reached into his coat, which he had not yet removed, and produced a small notebook. "His name is Thomas Very. He has serviced the gas lamps in that lane and the 2 adjacent courts for 11 years, which means he knows every building, every regular occupant, POS, and every departure from established routine, as well as a man knows his own parlour. He is the kind of witness who does not know that he is a witness, which is, in my experience, the most reliable variety." "What did he see?" "On 2 separate occasions in October, the 9th and the 23rd, dates falling within the period of the missing records, he observed a man entering the rear of the record's office building through the service, door in the lane, carrying on each occasion a parcel wrapped in oilcloth, at an hour between 1 and 2 in the morning." Holmes set the notebook on the table and turned it so that I could read the description he had transcribed from Very's account. "Medium height, well dressed for a night errand," meaning, Very said, that the coat was a good one, not a working man's coat, quietly, and with the purposeful directness of someone who knew exactly where he was going first. Occasion, Very thought nothing of it and finished his round. On the second he paused, because the man glanced along the lane before entering, and Very caught the face in the light of the lamp he had just serviced. I read the description in the notebook. It was spare and particular in the way that genuinely observed details tend to be, not the comprehensive portrait of imagination, but the selected, specific notation of a man who what he noticed, and was honest about the limits of his observation. Medium height, light colouring, a small scar or mark above the left brow, possibly. The coat a dark wool, double-breasted. "Mowbray," I said, "consistent with Mowbray." Very could not give me a positive identification, and I would not have asked him to attempt one at this stage. A premature and uncertain identification is a liability, not an asset, when the time comes to present a case. But the description does not exclude Mowbray. Taken alongside everything else, it advances the picture considerably. Holmes closed the notebook. What it confirms is the thing I required. Confirmed. That the person who treated those records made at least 2 visits after hours, both in October, both carrying materials that would account for the oilcloth wrapping. The compound, I identified, is sensitive to moisture, would require careful transport. And the chemical supplier you mentioned, the one who stocks the compound's components. Holmes had risen and was at last removing his coat, draping it over the back of his chair, with an absent-mindedness that told me his thoughts were running on ahead of the immediate conversation. A legal stationer in Holborn, from whom I obtained, by means I need not specify in detail, record of purchases during the past 12 months. The compound's key constituent, a particular formulation of oxalic derivative, was supplied on 3 occasions in the relevant period to a single private customer, who provided a name which is not Mowbray and not Mears, but which I have no doubt is one of the man's auxiliary arrangements. He paused at the mantelpiece. It is a further demonstration of his thoroughness. He did not purchase under either of his known identities. He used a third name for the transaction, the kind of precaution a man takes who has reason to anticipate that his connections might one day be traced. 3 names, I said. Andrew Mears, Adrian Mowbray, a third. For transactions he wished to keep at a distance from both. A careful man builds redundancy into his arrangements. The difficulty with redundancy is that each additional layer requires maintenance. Each false name requires a credible history. Each subsidiary arrangement requires renewal. Over time, the architecture of concealment becomes more elaborate than the thing it conceals, more fragile, because a complex structure has more points at which pressure can be applied. He turned from the mantelpiece with an expression that was not quite satisfaction, but its quieter predecessor. And then, there is the question of motive for delay. I had been waiting for him to raise it. You told me last week that motive must precede accusation. You have held back from Gregson. There must something still outstanding. One thing. He returned to his chair and sat down, leaning forward with his elbows, upon his knees in the attitude of a man about to say something he has been working toward for several days. I know what Mowbray did and broadly why he did it. I can place him in the records office, connect him to the chemical compound, link his buried history to the missing cases, demonstrate beyond reasonable doubt that Dawes' death was not self-inflicted. What I cannot yet present is the specific instrument, the document, record, the surviving piece of the original thing, whose discovery first threatened him and whose destruction he has been arranging in these careful, graduated steps. He was quiet for a moment. Without it, a defence counsel of ordinary competence could argue that the evidence, suggestive, amounts to a chain of circumstance rather than proof. Mowbray would know this. He has spent enough years in the court administration to understand what constitutes a prosecutable case. Half-burned memorandum Miss Vale brought, I said. The one with the partial surname, part of it. Not sufficient alone. Holmes looked at me directly. Which is why I asked Miss Vale, when she visited on Friday, whether her uncle's papers might contain further material of a similar kind. She was not certain, but thought it possible. I impressed upon her, as forcefully as I could without alarming her to an unproductive degree, that such papers, if they exist, require immediate securing, that Vale should remove them from his house and place them somewhere Mowbray cannot reach. You believe Mowbray knows of the memorandum. I believe that someone attempted to destroy it in Vale's own fireplace, which means either that Vale himself was persuaded to attempt its destruction, which I think unlikely, given his character, or that another party had access to Vale's study and made the attempt without his knowledge. Holmes was still for a moment, and I saw the brief, vertical furrow between his brows that appeared when a thought arrived, that he found genuinely uncomfortable, and that possibility, Watson, returns me to the question I raised last week. The third party, the one who may have introduced the information to Dorr, if that same party has also been moving through Vale's house. He stopped. From the table he picked up the small folded paper containing his notes on the chemical compound, opened it, read one line, and refolded it with the decisive motion of a man closing a subject. For the present, I have arranged to speak with Mowbray this afternoon, he said, not at the court, at his private rooms in Bloomsbury. He does not yet know that I am aware of the name Mears, or of Whitmore, or of Thomas Very. That ignorance is, at the moment, the most valuable thing I possess. He stood and reached for the cold coffee with an expression of mild resignation, temperature. I wish you to accompany me, Watson, in your professional capacity. My professional capacity? I am not investigating a medical matter. No. But a doctor accompanying a consulting detective to a private interview presents an appearance of formality that tends, in my experience, to steady a subject's nerves, which is precisely the opposite of what I require this afternoon. He allowed a pause of measured brevity. I need Mowbray off Bassant's. I need him to feel the ground shifting beneath a situation he believes he controls. And I need to see his hands. He said the last three words with the particular quietness of a man returning to a point he has not forgotten. Thought of the thumbprint on the door jamb. I thought of the broad, slightly elongated impression, the wall deeper on the inner edge. I had filed it in my memory as Holmes instructed, and I had not spoken of it since. You will know the print when you see it, I said. Known it since Thursday night. He set down the cup. The question has never been whether I could identify it. The question has been whether I could identify it in circumstances that cannot be challenged. He glanced at the clock. We leave at 2 o'clock. In the meantime, I suggest you read the morning paper. Pell has been formally charged, which means we have rather less time than I would prefer. Chapter 9. Holmes Explains. Mowbray's rooms were in a quiet street off Russell Square, in one of those Bloomsbury terraces which manage to suggest, through their uniform brick fronts and orderly window boxes, a life conducted with deliberate, self-conscious respectability. The neighbourhood was neither fashionable nor humble. It was the neighbourhood of a man who wished to be thought settled and professional without inviting the scrutiny that comes with conspicuous comfort. I noted this as we climbed the front steps, and then reproached myself for noting it, since I had by that point spent enough time in Holmes's company to find significance assembling itself, unbidden from the most ordinary particulars. Mowbray answered the door himself, which suggested he had either dismissed or never employed a servant for afternoon hours. He was dressed as I had seen him at Bedford Square, neatly, precisely, with the slightly over-arranged quality of a man for whom personal presentation is a considered act rather than a habit. His expression upon seeing us was one of controlled surprise, and it was controlled too well, wasn't it? None of the slight involuntary widening of the eyes, none of the brief loosening of the mouth, which genuine surprise produces. He had been expecting us, or something very like us, and had prepared his face accordingly. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson. He stepped back from the doorway, with every appearance of ease. Please come in. I confess this is unexpected. I apologize for arriving without notice, said Holmes pleasantly, following him into a small but well-ordered sitting room. I had a question or two which seemed to admit of no very satisfactory answer by correspondence. We sat. The room offered little to my eye beyond what I had anticipated from the exterior. Bookshelves arranged with professional care, writing desk, clear of anything personal, a single landscape watercolour of no particular merit. Nothing in it would have told a stranger much about its occupant, which was itself a kind of information. Holmes began, as he had told me he intended, an oblique angle, asking about the administrative reorganisation of the Records Office, about the procedures for handling cases discontinued before hearing, about the process by which a summons issued, and then recalled, would ordinarily be noted in the ledgers. Mowbray answered all of it with the smooth, ready competence I had observed at Bedford Square. He leaned back in his chair. His hands, which rested upon its arms, were still. They were broad hands, I noticed, with slightly elongated fingertips. The right bore a small ink stain at the base of the index finger, the occupational marking of a clerk. The left was clean. I watched Holmes watching them. "There is one matter," Holmes said, with a conversational lightness that did not entirely conceal the change of direction, which I have been unable to resolve through the records available to me, and which I wonder whether you might clarify. It concerns a property transaction in Shropshire, in the vicinity of Whitmore, approximately 9 years ago. Question of witnessed transfer instruments. The stillness in the room was of a different quality from the stillness that had preceded it. Mowbray's hands did not move. His expression did not alter. But something shifted behind his eyes, in the way that something shifts behind a door when weight is placed against it from the other side. "I am afraid," he said, after a pause that was perhaps 2 seconds longer than it ought to have been, that Shropshire property transactions fall somewhat outside my professional experience, which has been confined to London. Entirely so, I ask, only because the matter has some indirect bearing on the current inquiry. Through a connection with a former associate of yours, I believe, man named Kettering. The hands not dramatically, not the sudden betraying motion of a guilty man startled, caught. Merely a slight adjustment of the right hand upon the chair arm, a repositioning of the index finger, small and possibly unconscious effort at self-containment. Holmes saw it. I saw Holmes see it. "I know the name," Mowbray said carefully. "He was convicted some years ago. I had no more than a passing professional acquaintance with him. Of course, before London. During the period you spent in the Midlands, in whatever capacity, you would not have encountered him. Psst. I have worked in London throughout my professional career, Mr. Holmes." Holmes looked at him for a moment with the quiet, even intention of a man reading a page he has already read and is confirming from memory. Then he produced from his coat pocket the folded paper, taille containing the partially burned memorandum, and set it upon the low table between them without comment. Mowbray looked at it. He did not reach for it. He did not ask what it was. That, as I later reflected, is itself the decisive error. The error of a man who recognises an object he has no stated reason to recognise. "That document," Holmes said, retrieved from Mr. Vale's fireplace grate by his niece, who brought it to me last Friday. You will observe that the end is the same as the administrative notations in the Clerkenwell summons books. You will observe further, perhaps, the third line contains a partial surname which I have now completed to my own satisfaction. The surname is Mears. The first name is Andrew. The silence that followed was of the kind which has weight. Mowbray's composure did not collapse. I will give him that. It contracted rather visibly, as a man contracts against a blow he has absorbed, and is determining whether he can continue to stand. When he spoke, his voice had lost none of its surface control. But something beneath the surface had gone out of it, as a lamp goes out when the oil is spent, and only the warm glass remains. That document proves nothing specific, he said. Taken alone, no. Taken alongside Thomas Very's account of the nights of the Nice of the 9th and 23rd of October, the records of the Holborn stationer who supplied the oxalic cond compound. A third name I have since identified as yours, pressure impressions preserved in the paper of the blank summons book, the scored brass plate on the cabinet lock, and the thumbprint on the door jamb of the records room. A print whose distinctive wall elongated at the inner edge. I observed this afternoon upon your left hand. Taken alongside all of that, Mr. Mowbray or Mr. Mears, it proves a great deal. Holmes had not raised his voice. He had not leaned forward. He had delivered the architecture of the case with the unhurried precision of a man reading aloud from a document he prepared some time ago, and has merely been waiting for the appropriate occasion to present. I watched Mowbray through it all, and what I saw was not the theatrical unravelling of a man caught in a lie, but something quieter, and, in its way, more affecting. The exhausted recognition of a man who has known, for some time, that the structure he has been maintaining would eventually find its limit. The records, Holmes continued, were erased to remove every trace of proceedings in which forged or irregularly certified instruments might have been examined and questioned, instruments whose characteristics connected them, through method, if not always through direct evidence, to the work done at Whitmore, and to Kettering's subsequent London operations. Caleb Dorr brought to an awareness of your history by means I am still investigating, attempted to use that awareness as leverage. You could not permit that. The manner of his death was arranged to suggest suicide, and the fragment of court paper left beside him was, I think, intended as a warning to anyone else who might have been conducting their own inquiries, or as a signal to whoever had introduced the information to Dorr in the first place, to indicate that the problem had been managed. Mowbray was looking at the burned memorandum on the table between them. His hands were entirely still now, with the stillness of a man who has stopped trying to control his own expression, and has arrived at something simpler. You left it in Vale's fireplace, Holmes said more quietly. You had access to his study on the evening of the Bedford Square supper, when the company was briefly dispersed after dinner. You found the memorandum among his papers, recognised it, and attempted to destroy it. Fire was not well established, and the thing did not catch properly. You could not retrieve the remains without attracting attention, so you left them and trusted that the partial burning would render it unintelligible. He paused. You trusted incorrectly. Clock on Mowbray's mantelpiece marked the half-hour with a soft, domestic chime entirely incongruous with the nature of what was occurring in the room. There is one matter, Holmes said, on which I require clarification before I conclude. The party who brought the information to Dorr, who arranged for Dorr to learn what he learned about you, and when? Mowbray looked up from the memorandum. For the first time since Holmes had begun, something crossed his face that was not calculation or concealment, but a simpler, more human thing. The bitterness of a man who has, in the midst of everything else, been deceived. Her name, he said with a careful flatness, is Finch. Holmes was quiet for precisely the length of time it took me to understand the full implication of the name. And then he said, the gravity of a man to whom the answer was not entirely a surprise. Mrs. Eleanor Finch, the widow of the magistrate, who stood, as I have been aware for some days, I ought for some days to benefit, financially, from the disappearance of precisely those proceedings which touched upon the disputed estates under her late husband's jurisdiction. He rose from his chair. Yes, I had considered that possibility. I had not been certain of it until this moment. He went to the door and opened it, and I became aware for the first time that Inspector Gregg was standing in the hallway outside. Holmes, with characteristic foresight, had sent a note the previous evening, with 2 constables at his back, and the expression of a man who has arrived late to a conclusion, and is determined not to show it. Mowbray did not resist. He stood, straightened his coat with the automatic precision of long professional habit, walked with quiet dignity to the door. At the threshold he paused for a single moment and looked back at the room, at the careful, anonymous room, in which Andrew Mears had lived 7 years as Adrian Mowbray, with the expression of a man taking a last account of something he is, leaving behind for good. Then he went out, and the door closed, and the room was still. Chapter 10, the adventure concludes. Days that followed Mowbray's arrest moved with the particular rhythm of an affair in its closing stages. Not the clean, decisive finality that popular accounts of detective work tend to suggest, but the slower, more untidy process by which the legal machinery takes possession of a matter and begins to grind it into the form it requires. Holmes submitted his evidence to Gregson with a thoroughness that left the inspector, I thought, simultaneously grateful and somewhat deflated, in the manner of a man who has been handed a completed examination and asked only to sign his name at the bottom. Mrs. Eleanor Finch was taken into custody. 2 days after, Mowbray, on a Thursday morning, at her house in Kensington, Holmes had spent the intervening period assembling the secondary case, with the same methodical patience he had applied to the primary one. And when Gregson came to Baker Street on Wednesday evening to collect the supplementary materials, I observed that even he, not a man naturally inclined toward admiration, paused over the file with an expression that came as close to wonder as professional dignity would permit. The disputed estates, Holmes told him, poured the whisky, and Gregson settled into the basket chair with the weariness of a man who has been running to keep pace with events not of his devising. Mrs. Finch stood to inherit a substantial additional portion of her late husband's accumulated judicial interests if 3 specific proceedings were resolved in her favour. Those 3 proceedings appear among the 43 missing summonses. She could not herself erase the records. She had no access to the court office and no means of obtaining it. But she possessed, through her years as a magistrate's wife, a comprehensive familiarity with the administration of the court and with the private histories of those who served within it. She knew about Mears, said Gregson. She had known for some time, perhaps 2 years, perhaps longer. Woman of her intelligence and her access to the late magistrate's correspondence would have had ample opportunity to identify the discrepancy between Mowbray's stated history and the truth of it. She did not act upon that knowledge immediately, which tells us something about her patience as well as her calculation. Holmes settled back into his chair. When the reorganization of the court's filicui had a natural urgency, the threat that old records might be systematically reviewed, she saw her opportunity. She could not approach Mowbray directly. That would have exposed her own knowledge of his identity and given him the initiative. Instead, she introduced the information to Dorr, who was already in financial communication with several of the parties named in those proceedings, through an intermediary whose identity I've traced to a clerk in Dorr's own office. A man who received a single, generous payment in October and who has since given a full account of the transaction to Gregson's sergeant. Gregson turned his glass in his hands. She calculated that Mowbray would silence Dorr. She calculated that Mowbray, cornered and desperate, would do whatever was necessary to protect himself, and that, in doing so, he would also, incidentally, accomplish the destruction of the records she required destroyed. She needed only to point the instrument and allow its own nature to do the rest. Paused. She miscalculated in one respect. She assumed that Dorr's death would close the matter, that Pell's visible corruption would provide a sufficient official explanation, and that the inquiry would go no further. She did not anticipate that Vale would consult me, nor that his niece would prove so observant a guardian of the family papers was. A silence in which the fire settled and the traffic outside conducted its evening commerce with complete indifference to the conversation within. She will say, Gregson ventured, that she knew nothing of any murder, that she merely passed on information she happened to possess, no knowledge of what use would be made of it. And the argument will require careful handling by the prosecution, because it is not without a certain technical merit. Holmes folded his hands. What defeats it, I think, is the memorandum. She placed it in Vale's fireplace. Not Mowbray. She had access to Vale's study during the Bedford Square supper, as did Mowbray. I confirmed both movements during that evening through conversation with Vale's manservant, who is the attentive sort, and whose testimony has been secured. She recognised the memorandum in Vale's papers and attempted to destroy it because it connected Mowbray's former name to the court records, and that connection, once established, leads inevitably back to her own knowledge of his history and the use she made of it. An innocent woman does not burn a document she has no stated reason to find significant. Gregson closed the file and finished his whisky. He stood with the air of a man settling a considerable mental account. I owe you an acknowledgment, Mr. Holmes. You owe me nothing at all. The case presented its own solution. I merely declined to accept the first one offered. After Gregson had gone, I remained by the fire while Holmes occupied himself at the chemical table, something entirely unrelated to the affair. A series of tests upon paper fibres that I understood to be preliminary work for a monograph he had mentioned some months previously. The sitting room had resumed its habitual appearance. The chemical apparatus, the newspapers in their accumulated disorder, the Persian slipper upon the mantelpiece, the familiar smell of tobacco and reagents that was, for all its peculiarity, as domestic a smell as any I knew. There is one thing, I said presently, that you have not fully explained to me. Only one? Holmes turned from the table with the slight lift of the brow that served him as a smile. The memorandum in Vale's fireplace. You said on Monday that someone had attempted to destroy it, that either Vale had been persuaded to burn it, or another party had done so without his knowledge. When did you become certain it was Mrs. Finch, and not Mowbray? Holmes turned back to his apparatus, and was quiet for a moment, in the manner of a man selecting not the answer itself, but the most useful form in which to deliver it. When Mowbray told me her name in his sitting room, it confirmed what I had already suspected for several days. But The point at which I moved from suspicion to reasonable certainty was the morning after I returned from Whitmore Fund. I was reviewing the guest movements at the Bedford Square supper. Through the manservant, as I mentioned, and I established that Mowbray had been in the dining room or on the stairs throughout the period in question. He had no opportunity to enter the study. Mrs. Finch, however, had excused herself from company. For approximately 12 minutes during the later part of the evening, for which the stated reason was a headache, and the actual reason was, as we now know, rather more purposeful. Mowbray had his own reasons to want it destroyed. Certainly. And he would have destroyed it had he known of its existence. What he did not know, what Mrs. Finch was careful he should not know, was that Vale had found it at all. She was operating on 2 levels simultaneously, Watson, and managing her relationship with Mowbray's ignorance as carefully as she managed everything else. Each knew something dangerous about the other. Neither knew precisely what the other knew. It was a partnership of mutual leverage, partnerist, and like all such partnerships it contained within itself the inevitability of its own dissolution. I thought of Mowbray's face at the mention of her name. That flat, exhausted bitterness, the look of a man who has been used as an instrument and knows it. It was not a pleasant thing to have witnessed, and I found I could not entirely withhold a measure of sympathy for the wreckage of the identity he had so carefully constructed, even in full knowledge of what he had done to preserve it. He was in some respects an able man, I said. In most respects, an able man. Holmes set down the glass rod he had been using and turned to face the room with an expression of quiet finality. Ability is not virtue, Watson, neither is it negligible. The tragedy of a man like Mowbray is not that he was unintelligent or reckless. It is that he invested his considerable intelligence entirely in the maintenance of an architecture built upon a fault. Every year of competent, blameless service at Clerkenwell was, simultaneously, another year of distance from his past, and another year of dependence upon that distance, remaining undisturbed. It is an exhausting way to live, and when the ground finally shifted, the whole structure came down at once. Not because it was weakly built, but because it had no honest foundation. He crossed to his chair and took up his pipe with the air of a man returning to simpler satisfactions. Pell will be dealt with leniently, I think, given that the charges against him are now properly confined to what he actually did. Vale has his records office restored, or will have once the administration has recovered its composure. Miss Vale, throughout the most clear-sighted person connected with the affair, will presumably continue to be underestimated by everyone around her. He settled back. The courts will manage the rest. It is no longer our concern. Outside, the November air had sharpened toward the clean cold of an approaching winter, and the street lamps of Baker Street burned steadily in the early dark, casting their familiar gold upon the pavement below. London went about its business, its layered, intricate, largely decent business, with its undercurrent of concealment and its persistent capacity for surprise. And I sat for a while in the comfortable silence of the room before taking up my pen. I have set this account down as faithfully as I am able, with the limitations that memory and narrative impose upon events which, in their actual unfolding, had neither the clean shape of a story nor the satisfying pace of one. What they had instead was the quality that I have found in every investigation I have been privileged to observe from Holmes's side, quality of truth emerging gradually, under patient attention, from beneath the surface of a carefully arranged appearance. Holmes told me once, and I have thought of it often since, that the criminal's fundamental error is the assumption that concealment and erasure are the same thing. They are not. A surface can be cleaned, and a record can be chemically dissolved, but the pressure of what was once written upon a thing persists in the body of the thing itself, waiting for a light held at the correct angle and a mind patient enough to read by it. A falsehood may be elaborate, he said one evening, beside the Baker Street fire. When the case was done and the cold had come fully in, reality possesses one advantage which invention can never wholly imitate: inconsistency. The real world contradicts itself in small, honest, irreconcilable ways. A fabricated account is always, somewhere, too smooth. He drew on his pipe and considered the fire for a moment. That smoothness, Watson, is the one thing a careful criminal cannot eliminate. It is the very mark of his care. I closed my notes that night, and have not, until now, reopened them. I record this adventure in the belief that among all the cases in which I served as Holmes's companion and chronicler, few demonstrated more plainly the principle upon which all his work, at its best, was founded, that absence, silence, and apparent blankness are themselves a form of evidence, and that the truth, however thoroughly a man believes he has erased it, will, in the end, leave its impression.